The day Sadie Mercer stood on the crumbling wooden steps of the Harlan Creek Frontier Orphanage with 3 children clinging to her skirts and heard the word, "No," spoken with the finality of a coffin lid, she made herself a silent promise that she would not cry, not in front of the children, and not in front of the man who had just said it. It was the autumn of 1878. And the Kansas plains were burning gold and copper under a sky so wide and blue it seemed almost cruel, the kind of beauty that mocked you when your circumstances were dire. Sadie was 24 years old, with chestnut hair that had not been properly brushed in 3 days, a dress that had seen too many washes in creek water, and eyes the color of weathered sage, gray-green and steady, even when the rest of her was anything but. She had walked 7 miles that morning from the small claim house where she and the children had been sheltering, a drafty structure belonging to a widow who had finally, gently, told her that she could not keep feeding 4 extra mouths through the coming winter. The children behind her were not her own by blood, but they were hers in every way that mattered. There was Clara, age 7, dark-haired and watchful, who had stopped speaking after her parents died of typhoid fever on the trail west 6 months ago. There was Eli, age 5, Clara's younger brother, who compensated for his sister's silence by talking nearly without pause, though his words often tumbled into each other like rocks down a hillside. And then there was baby Thomas, not quite 2 years old, round-cheeked and serious, who had been left in Sadie's care by a dying woman on a westbound stage 3 months prior. The woman, barely older than Sadie herself, had pressed the baby into her arms and whispered a name, Thomas, before she was gone, and Sadie had simply never put him down after that. Sadie was not their mother. She was not their aunt or their guardian in any legal sense. She was a woman who had been traveling west herself, seeking work as a schoolteacher in a new territory, when circumstances and the particular softness of her heart had conspired to load her down with 3 children and no real plan. She did not regret it. She regretted very little, but she was frightened, and she was hungry, and the man at the orphanage door, a heavy-set administrator named Mr. Pruitt, with a mustache that seemed to absorb most of his expression, had just told her that the institution was full. Full, she repeated, as though the word might rearrange itself into something more reasonable. Full, Mr. Pruitt confirmed, not unkindly but without much warmth either. He had the practiced neutrality of a man who delivered bad news regularly and had learned to survive it emotionally. We have 43 children currently in residence and room for 45, and those 2 remaining spots are already spoken for. We have a policy. We cannot take informal placements. If you are not next of kin and do not have documented guardianship, we cannot process the children regardless. Their next of kin are dead, Sadie said, keeping her voice level. Every last one of them. I understand, Miss Mercer, truly, but our charter requires legal documentation. Without it, I cannot accept them, no matter the circumstances. He glanced past her at the children with an expression that was almost sorry. There are other institutions further east. In Wichita, perhaps, or you might apply to the county. I walked 7 miles this morning, Sadie said quietly, with a 2-year-old on my hip. Mr. Pruitt had the grace to look uncomfortable. I am very sorry, Miss Mercer. I wish I could do more. He closed the door. Sadie stood on those steps for a long moment, staring at the painted wood grain of the closed door, breathing slowly and deliberately the way her mother had taught her when she was small and prone to crying at injustice. In, hold out. In, hold out. Clara pressed her face against Sadie's arm. Eli was asking something about whether there would be biscuits inside and whether they got to stay, and Sadie gently rested her hand on his head without answering. Thomas, balanced on her left hip, reached up and patted her cheek with one small, damp hand, as though comforting her, and that nearly broke her composure entirely. She turned around slowly and looked out at the main street of Harlan Creek, Kansas, which was not much of a street at all, a post office, a dry goods store, a livery stable, a saloon, a small church that looked like it might blow over in a strong wind, and a scattering of other buildings that indicated a town in the earliest stages of deciding whether to exist. Dust moved along the ground in lazy spirals. A dog slept in the shadow of a water trough. Two men on horseback were riding in from the eastern road, their horses walking at an easy pace, the men talking to each other in the unhurried way of people who had been riding a long time and had learned to conserve their energy. Sadie descended the orphanage steps and stood on the street, trying to think. She had $11 and some change in the small purse tucked inside her dress. She had no horse, no wagon, and no connections in Harlan Creek. The widow's house was 7 miles back and no longer an option. Wichita was more than 100 miles east, and she had no money for the stage for all 4 of them. The weight of the situation pressed down on her with the particular heaviness of having no good options. Only a series of options that were less bad than others, and even those were hard to see clearly. She was so deep in calculation that she did not notice the 2 riders had pulled up nearby until one of the horses snorted, and she glanced up instinctively. There were 2 men. One was older, perhaps 50, with a silver beard and the leather-creased face of someone who had spent decades in open country. The other was younger. She placed him around 30, maybe a year or 2 past it, tall in the saddle, with dark hair showing beneath the brim of a well-worn hat, broad shoulders inside a faded canvas work shirt, and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been set against difficulty often enough that it had become its natural expression. He had dark eyes, observant and steady, and he was looking at her with an attention that was not rude or presumptuous but was also not indifferent. She looked away. She had not asked to be looked at. "Pardon me, ma'am," the younger man said, and his voice was low and measured, a voice that did not need to be louder than it was because it carried without effort. "You all right?" "Fine, thank you," Sadie said automatically, adjusting Thomas on her hip. She was aware of how she must look. Standing in front of a closed orphanage door, holding a toddler with 2 small children wrapped around her like barnacles, the dust of a 7-mile walk on her hem, and whatever expression her face had settled into after being told no. There was a pause. "Beggin' your pardon," the older man said, tipping his hat, "but you don't look fine if you don't mind my saying." Sadie looked at him directly. She was too tired to be polished about it. "The orphanage is full," she said, because that seemed to be the simplest summary of the situation. The younger man straightened slightly in his saddle. His horse shifted beneath him, and he settled it with a small, unconscious movement of his knees. "They turned you away." "They turned the children away," Sadie corrected, because she wanted to be precise. "I am not the one who needs the bed. These 3 are." The older man, whose name she would later learn was Pete Duggan, gave a low sound that conveyed exactly what he thought of institutions that turned children away. The younger man, she did not know his name yet, had swung down from his saddle before she fully registered that he was moving. He dropped the reins over the hitching post nearby with the practiced ease of a man who did not think twice about horses, and he walked toward her with an unhurried stride and took off his hat. "Abel Rhodes," he said, introducing himself. He had a slight squint from years of looking into sunlit distances, and up close his eyes were not simply dark. They were a deep brown with flecks of copper in them, warm in a way that his reserved expression had not telegraphed from a distance. "And this is Pete Duggan. We ride for the Harlow cattle operation, about 12 miles east of here." "Sadie Mercer," she said. She did not offer her hand because she was using both of them to manage Thomas, who had decided he wanted down. She let him slide to the ground and kept hold of his wrist as he immediately tried to investigate a clod of dirt near the hitching post. "These your children?" Abel asked. "No," she said. "And yes." "It is complicated." He tilted his head slightly. He did not ask her to simplify it. He just waited, which she found unexpectedly disarming. Most people filled silence immediately, as though it were a social emergency. Abel Rhodes seemed comfortable in silence the way a man is comfortable in a coat he has worn long enough to break it in. She told him. She was not sure why she told him so completely, perhaps because she was tired, or because there was something in the quality of his listening that invited honesty, or perhaps simply because the situation was what it was, and there was no flattering version of it. She told him about the stage, about the dying woman and Thomas, about Clara and Eli's parents and the typhoid fever, about the widow's house and the 7-mile walk, and the man with the mustache who had said the word, full as though it were an answer. When she finished, Abel looked at the children. Clara had come slightly forward during the telling, not because she had anything to say, but in the way that quiet children sometimes move toward conversations that concern them. Eli was now crouched beside Thomas, examining the same clod of dirt with the intense scientific focus of a 5-year-old who has found it worthwhile. Abel looked at all three of them for a moment, then he looked at Sadie. "Then they come with me," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. The children." He said it without drama, as though the decision were obvious and had already been made some time ago by some part of him that operated below conscious deliberation. "And you? The Harlow Ranch has a bunkhouse and a main house, and there's space. Mrs. Harlow, she's the owner's widow. She runs the house, and she's been looking for someone to take on some of the domestic work since her hired girl left in June. It's not a permanent arrangement for the children, but it's a roof and food while we figure something out." Sadie stared at him. She was not naive. She knew what the world was, and she knew that offers from strange men on the frontier were not always what they appeared to be. She had traveled enough and been enough places to have developed a reasonable instinct for the difference between genuine intention and its counterfeits. Abel Rhodes was watching her assess him, and he bore the assessment without fidgeting or deflecting. His hat was in his hands, and he was looking at her directly, and there was nothing in his expression that she could not account for. Behind him, Pete Duggan had climbed down from his horse and was already crouched in the dirt next to Eli and Thomas, examining the famous clod of dirt with an expression of grave interest that Eli clearly found extremely satisfying. "Why?" Sadie asked. Abel considered the question seriously, as she somehow already sensed he would. "Because the alternative is you standing here on this street with 3 children and no plan, and it's October in Kansas, which means in about 6 weeks it is going to be cold enough to kill a man who isn't prepared for it, let alone a woman and 3 small children. That is a practical reason," Sadie said. "I appreciate it. And because," he added more quietly, "no child ought to be turned away from a door. That's not a world I can stand by and watch if I have the means to do something about it." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at Thomas, who had abandoned the dirt clod in favor of trying to eat a pebble, which Pete Duggan was gently redirecting. She looked at Eli, who was now telling Pete Duggan at great speed about a frog he had seen 3 days ago. She looked at Clara, who was watching Abel with the careful, measuring look of a child who has learned that adults sometimes say one thing and mean another. "All right," Sadie said. "We will accept your help, Mr. Rhodes. Thank you." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but something that occupied the same general territory. He put his hat back on. "Pete," he called, "you think you can manage the wagon from the supply store? I'll take Miss Mercer and the children on horseback." "1 horse for all of you?" Sadie asked. "Mine's big enough," he said, "and it's 12 miles, better than walking." She could not argue with that. The ride to the Harlow Ranch was the first time in weeks that Sadie had not been actively solving a problem, and the novelty of that was so unfamiliar that it took her several miles to settle into it. Abel rode with Clara in front of him, as Clara had shown not the slightest hesitation about climbing up once he'd offered, which surprised Sadie and apparently surprised Abel too, given the brief expression that crossed his face when the small, silent girl simply reached her arms up and waited to be lifted. Sadie rode behind Abel with Thomas on her lap, and Eli pressed between them, still talking, undeterred by the fact that no one was responding specifically to each word. She was closer to Abel than she had been since he lifted her onto the horse, and she was aware of the warmth of him through the canvas of his shirt and the steady, grounded way he rode. He did not bounce or shift unnecessarily. He moved with the horse the way water moves with the current, and she found herself unconsciously matching the rhythm of it. "How long have you worked for the Harlow operation?" she asked, because the silence had become comfortable enough that she felt she could break it without destroying anything. "Going on 6 years," he said. "Came out from Tennessee when I was 24, worked my way west." "You're from Tennessee?" "East Tennessee. Mountains, not flatlands." "Took me a full year to get used to the sky being this big." She understood that. The sky over the Kansas plains was genuinely overwhelming if you had grown up anywhere with hills or trees to interrupt it. "What made you come west?" A pause. Not evasive, she was already learning to read the difference between his thoughtful pauses and his deflecting ones. This was thoughtful. "My father died and left the farm to my older brother. That's how it was, and I don't begrudge him it. But there was nothing else for me there, so I came here. Worked a drive from Texas up through Indian Territory, ended up in Kansas, and found this operation needed a man who knew horses and cattle and wasn't afraid of the work." "And you stayed?" "I stayed," he confirmed. She thought about that 6 years in one place, which on the frontier was not nothing. It meant he had found something worth staying for, or had built it. She wondered which one. The Harlow Ranch appeared as the light was beginning to soften toward late afternoon, the house sitting in a shallow depression with 2 enormous cottonwood trees flanking it like sentinels, their leaves gone gold and rattling in the wind. There were 2 large barns, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and fenced pasture stretching out on 3 sides. Cattle moved slowly in the distance. Several horses stood at the fence near the first barn with the bovine patience of horses that were accustomed to being looked at, and had given up being vain about it. A woman came out of the main house as they rode in. She was perhaps 60, sturdily built with white hair pinned beneath a calico bonnet, and she walked with the brisk purposefulness of someone who had never once in her life moved from one place to another without a reason for it. This was Mrs. Harlow Margaret Harlow, whose husband Franklin had built the operation, and whose husband Franklin had died of a heart complaint 4 years prior, leaving her with a working ranch and a stubbornness that more than made up for his absence. She looked at the situation, Abel on his horse with a small girl and a woman and a toddler, with the expression of someone rapidly processing new information. Pete, pulling in behind with the supply wagon, gave her a wave that suggested everything was fine, and he would explain later. "Mrs. Harlow," Abel said, touching his hat as he swung down, "I apologize for arriving with more people than I left with. This is Miss Sadie Mercer, and these are Clara, Eli, and Thomas. They needed a place to land." Mrs. Harlow looked at Sadie. Sadie looked back at her, trying to appear competent and not desperate, which was genuinely difficult given the current state of her dress. "Can you cook?" Mrs. Harlow asked. "Yes, ma'am," Sadie said. "And clean, sew, keep accounts, and teach children their letters." Mrs. Harlow's expression shifted into something that might have been satisfaction, in the way that a puzzle piece settling into place is satisfying. "All right then," she said. "Come in. There's stew on." It was, in the economy of Margaret Harlow, a complete welcome. The ranch became home in the way that places do when you are tired enough to let them gradually, then all at once. Sadie had expected to feel like a visitor indefinitely, but the work of the place absorbed her so completely that within a week she could not imagine not being there. She helped Mrs. Harlow with the cooking and the preserving and the accounts that needed to be kept for the cattle operation. She swept and laundered and mended. She began teaching Clara and Eli their letters in the mornings at the kitchen table, with Thomas sitting on the floor nearby building precarious towers from dried corn cobs with focused determination. The children settled too, each in their way. Eli attached himself almost immediately to Pete Duggan, following him around the yard during daylight hours with an intensity that Pete bore with surprising patience, answering Eli's approximately 10,000 daily questions about horses, ropes, saddles, and various other frontier matters, with the measured thoroughness of a man who understood that children's questions were genuine and deserved genuine answers. Thomas's cheeks grew rounder on Mrs. Harlow's cooking, and he took his first solo steps across the kitchen floor on a Wednesday morning in November, watched by everyone in the house with the breathless attention that first steps always command. Clara spoke. It happened in the third week, quietly, without warning or particular ceremony. She was sitting at the kitchen table during letters practice, and Sadie had placed a McGuffey reader in front of her and asked her to look at the word and tell her what it said. Clara had stared at the page for a long moment, and then, in a voice like something being carefully unwrapped from layers of protection, said the word apple. Sadie had said, very calmly, "That's right, sweetheart," and moved to the next word, because she had sensed that making a great occasion of it would frighten the voice back into hiding. After the lesson, Clara had climbed into Sadie's lap and sat there for a long time without saying anything else, and Sadie had held her and thought about how some kinds of healing were so quiet and so necessary that they almost looked like nothing happening at all. Abel was rarely in the house during working hours. The fall cattle work was consuming. There were animals to be moved, preparations for the winter to be made, endless fence lines to check and mend. But in the evenings he was present, often on the porch with a cup of coffee, or in the kitchen after supper when Mrs. Harlow was knitting and the children were being settled, and Sadie would come back downstairs after tucking everyone in and find him there reading by lamplight or working on some piece of tack. She had not expected to like him as much as she did. That sounds unkind, and she did not mean it unkindly. She had simply learned not to expect too much from anyone, a lesson the past 6 months had taught with considerable emphasis. But Abel Rhodes consistently exceeded whatever modest estimate she made of him. He was not a man who talked about himself very much, but he was a man who listened exceptionally well, which is perhaps rarer and more valuable. He remembered things she said and referenced them later, not in a calculating way but in the way of someone who actually filed things away because they found them interesting. He was funny in a dry, understated way that she did not always see coming, which made it better when she did. He was gentle with the children without being performative about it. He did not make shows of his kindness. He simply was kind, the way some people are tall without announcing it. She noticed when he first crouched down to talk to Clara at Clara's level, which he did naturally, and without thinking the first time Clara came near him, and she noticed how Clara, who was still so wary with most people, had simply looked at him and then turned away to her business in a way that was almost acceptance. She noticed how he never made Eli feel like his talking was too much, just redirected it when necessary with a calm, easy manner. She noticed how he had shown Thomas, who was beginning to show opinions about things, which specific horses were gentle enough for a small person to pat. She noticed too many things about him, and she knew it, and she was not sure what to do with that awareness. It was a Tuesday evening in early November when they had their first real conversation, not the polite exchanges they had been managing, useful and friendly as those were, but the kind of conversation that pulls back the surface of things and shows you what is underneath. The children were in bed. Mrs. Harlow had retired early with a headache. Sadie had come downstairs to check that the fire in the kitchen stove was properly banked, and Abel had been sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper he was writing on, and instead of exchanging pleasantries and retiring, something had caused them both to linger. She had poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the other end of the table, and then they had talked. He told her about his family in Tennessee, his brother Samuel, who was a steady, decent man, and his mother who had died when Abel was 16, and the way his father had grown quieter and more distant after that loss, a man retreating into himself in a way that Abel had not known how to follow or reverse. She told him about her own family, her parents, and the schoolhouse in Missouri where her father had taught, and the fever that had taken both of them the same winter when Sadie was 19, leaving her alone and practical and determined to find something worthwhile to do with a life that suddenly had no predetermined shape. "Is that why you were going west?" he asked. "To teach school?" "There is more need for teachers in the territories," she said. "Back east the positions were always full and competed for fiercely. Out here they are desperate for anyone who can read and has the patience to teach others. I thought it was a practical way to be useful." "You seem like someone who needs to be useful," he said, not critically but with the observational tone he used when he was being precise. She considered arguing with that and decided not to. "I suppose I do. Is that an unflattering quality?" "No," he said simply. "I think it's an admirable one. I'm the same way myself. The days when there's not much to do sit uneasily on me. You do not strike me as a man who has many of those days." A corner of his mouth moved. "That's true. I've always made sure of that." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. The lamp between them was low, casting warm light against the rough-hewn walls of the kitchen, and outside the wind was moving across the plains with that particular November intensity that made indoor warmth feel even more significant. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why did you stop? On the street in town? You did not have to. You could have ridden past." He was quiet for a moment. She had begun to understand his silences, and she waited for this one to resolve itself, watching the lamplight move across his face. "I suppose," he said slowly, "that I have been in situations where I needed someone to stop and no one did. Not catastrophically, nothing dramatic. Just small moments where the difference between someone taking a minute and no one doing so was significant." He looked at his coffee cup. "I was 17 and newly off the farm, and I did not have enough money to get on the stage I needed to catch, and a man I had never met paid the difference. He did not ask anything for it. He said his father had told him the world worked better if you passed things along, so that is what he was doing. I never forgot that. I have tried to pass things along." She felt something settle in her chest, a kind of recognition. "That is a generous way to move through the world." "It costs less than it looks like it does," he said. She shook her head slightly. "I do not think that is entirely true." He looked at her then, and the look lasted a moment longer than looks usually did, not uncomfortably, but with a quality of attention that made her aware of herself in a way she had not been in a long time. She looked back at him without looking away, because she had never been particularly good at looking away from things that interested her. "I should get some sleep," she said finally, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Yes," he agreed. But neither of them moved for another few seconds, and then she stood and gathered her coffee cup and said good night, and he said good night, and she went upstairs thinking that something had shifted tonight in some way she could not entirely name but was quite certain had happened. The weeks that followed were a careful dance, and if you had asked Sadie whether she was dancing, she would have denied it, which would have been honest in the sense that she was not doing it consciously, and dishonest in the sense that she absolutely was doing it. She was more aware of Abel's comings and goings than was strictly necessary. She sometimes chose to be in the kitchen at the hour she knew he would come in from the evening work, not for any planned reason, simply because she did not actively choose to be elsewhere. She noticed when he laughed a genuine laugh, which was not frequent, but which when it appeared was a warm, whole-bodied thing that transformed his usually reserved expression entirely. And she noticed that he noticed her. It was not overt. Abel Rhodes was not an overt man. But she caught him watching her sometimes, across the kitchen table or from the porch, with an attention that was not accidental, and he would meet her eyes when she caught him without embarrassment, simply hold the look for a beat and then redirect himself to whatever he had been doing as though he was trying not to spook something skittish by moving too fast. She was not skittish, but she was cautious. She had learned to be cautious. The first crack in her caution appeared on a Saturday in mid-November. Pete Duggan had ridden into Harlan Creek for supplies, and returned with news that the man who had told Sadie the orphanage was full. Mr. Pruitt had apparently applied to the county seat for additional funding. There was talk that a proper children's home might be established in the area within the year. It was good news, theoretically. Pete had relayed it thinking she would find it comforting. Instead, she had gone very still at the kitchen table where she was working on the account ledgers, and Mrs. Harlow had looked up from her knitting, and then looked at Sadie's face, and then looked back at her knitting with the knowing expression of a woman who sees a great deal more than she comments on. A proper children's home. A place for Clara and Eli and Thomas to be placed legally, with documentation and structure. She knew she should want that. She knew it was the right thing to want. But the thought of it, of these three particular small people being placed somewhere, of mornings without Eli's narrations and evenings without Clara's quiet presence and days without the particular weight of Thomas on her hip, opened up something in her chest that was large and cold and not pleasant. She went and found Abel in the barn that afternoon, where he was working on a wagon wheel with the careful attention of a man who finds satisfaction in making things function properly. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment, watching him, before she spoke. "Pete told me about the children's home," she said. He looked up. He took one look at her face and set down his tools and gave her his full attention, which was so characteristic of him that she almost smiled even though she was not in a smiling state of mind. "He told me too," Abel said. "It is good news," she said. "Yes, I know it is good news." "I know you know that," he said carefully. She crossed her arms over her chest, which she knew was a defensive posture and did not care at the moment. It would be the right thing. They would have stability. Legal standing. They could be adopted by families who could properly provide for them. "All of that is true," Abel said. "I am aware," she said, "that I cannot keep 3 children indefinitely. I have no home of my own. No income beyond what Mrs. Harlow is giving me for the work here. No legal standing as their guardian. I cannot." She stopped. Abel waited. "I do not want to give them up," she said, and it came out raw, which she had not intended. "I know that is not, I know the practical reality is clear. But I carried Thomas across 2 territories on a stage, and he took his first steps in that kitchen, and Clara." She stopped again, because her voice was doing something uncooperative. "Sadie," he said quietly. He had not called her by her first name before. It sounded different than she expected, careful and sure at the same time, the way he seemed to do most things. She looked at him. "Nothing is happening immediately," he said. "A children's home taking shape is a long process. You have time to think about what you want, what is possible. And when the time runs out," he looked at her steadily, "then we think about it then, together if you're willing." She blinked. "Together. You are not in this by yourself," he said. "You have not been since October. I want you to know that." It was the most he had said directly on the subject of his intentions, which up until this moment had been expressed entirely in the language of quiet actions and carefully held looks. She regarded him across the dim, hay-scented interior of the barn with the particular uncertainty of someone standing at the edge of something large. "Why?" she asked, the same question she had asked on the street in Harlan Creek. "Because I would like to keep helping you," he said. And then, after a beat that was slightly shorter than his usual pauses, as though he had decided to say the thing before he could think better of it, "and because I have been finding it harder than usual to look forward to any day that does not include you in it, which is new for me. I don't say that lightly." The barn was very quiet. Somewhere outside, Eli was making a sound that suggested he had found either something exciting or something he should not have. The horses shifted in their stalls. "I see," Sadie said. "I'm not asking anything of you," he said. "I'm just telling you so you know." She unfolded her arms. "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it in more ways than she knew how to say just then. She went back to the house, and he went back to the wagon wheel, and nothing dramatic happened. But something had been said and heard, and the shape of things between them was different after that, even if neither of them named it right away. December came in hard and cold, the kind of cold that made the plains feel like the loneliest place on earth unless you were somewhere warm with people you trusted. Sadie was somewhere warm with people she trusted, and she was beginning to understand just how much that mattered. On a Wednesday evening with snow drifting against the windows, and the whole household gathered in the main room around the fire, Pete Duggan playing a rather ambitious harmonica piece, while Eli conducted an invisible orchestra with a wooden spoon, Mrs. Harlow knitting with the expression of a woman who has survived many winters and intends to survive many more. Clara sitting close to Sadie and leaning slightly against her shoulder while she listened to the music. And Thomas asleep in Sadie's lap, having fought the good fight against consciousness and lost, on that particular evening. Abel came in from checking the animals and stood in the doorway of the room, snow melting from his hat brim, and looked at the scene in front of him. He looked at it with the expression of a man who has just realized he is looking at something he wants very badly, and he stood there in the doorway a moment longer than was needed to simply take off his hat and coat. And Sadie, watching him over Clara's head, saw that expression and felt something in her own chest answer it. She smiled at him. It was a small smile, not particularly dramatic, but it was the first fully unguarded one she had given him, not the polite smile or the appreciative smile, but the one that came from somewhere deeper and quieter. He smiled back, and the transformation of his usual reserved expression into something warm and open and completely undefended was the most striking thing she had seen in a very long time. Pete hit a complicated note on the harmonica and Eli's conducting became frantic and Thomas stirred in his sleep, and the moment passed back into ordinary evening, and Abel came in and took off his coat and poured himself coffee, and life continued. But something had been decided, Sadie thought. Not formally, not yet, but somewhere below the formal level where the real decisions are actually made. Christmas at the Harlow Ranch was a particular kind of lovely, not grand, because nothing on the frontier was grand, but full of small, deliberate warmth. Mrs. Harlow produced a recipe for molasses cookies that Eli declared was the best thing he had ever tasted, and Clara confirmed with a nod of the highest seriousness. There was a small pine tree that Pete and Abel had dragged in from along the creek bed, and the children decorated it with strings of dried berries and small scraps of ribbon that Mrs. Harlow donated from her sewing basket. Thomas ate one of the dried berries off the lower branches and was redirected approximately 6 times over the course of the evening. Abel had, at some point during the prior week, ridden into Harlan Creek alone and come back with something he had not mentioned. On Christmas morning, he produced 3 small items that he set out with the straightforward, slightly awkward manner of a man who is more comfortable with deeds than with the presentation of them. For Eli, a small carved wooden horse, beautifully made, clearly done by a craftsman who understood what a 5-year-old valued. For Clara, a proper book, not a reader or a primer but an actual story book, which she received with an expression of such complete and radiant joy that Abel looked momentarily undone by it. And for Thomas, a soft leather ball that Thomas immediately sat on, finding this more interesting than the conventional use. He had also brought something for Sadie, which he gave her quietly, not in the middle of the children's delight but afterward, handing it to her in the kitchen when they were briefly alone. It was a small journal, the cover made of good dark leather with a brass clasp. She turned it over in her hands. "I thought," he said, with the slightly careful precision of someone choosing words deliberately, "that a person who has been through the things you have been through might find it useful to have somewhere to put it all down, where it belongs to you." She looked at the journal for a long moment and then looked at him. "Thank you, Abel," she said. "Truly." "Merry Christmas, Sadie," he said. She had gotten him a small thing, a good pair of leather gloves that she had purchased from Mrs. Harlow's store of goods, having saved up from her wages with this purpose in mind. He received them with an expression that suggested a good pair of practical gloves was something that genuinely pleased him, which she had counted on. He was not a man who wanted grand gestures. He was a man who wanted things that were useful and meant. The new year of 1879 arrived with a spectacular ice storm that coated every surface of the ranch in a 1/4 inch of glass and made the world look like something from a dream. Abel and Pete spent 2 days carefully breaking ice from the water troughs and checking that the animals were all right, and Sadie spent those days inside with Mrs. Harlow and the children, and the contained warmth of the house during a storm felt like something precious and intentional, a shared life that had grown up out of accident and necessity, and had become something it was hard to imagine not having. It was in January that Abel found her in the barn one morning. She had gone to check on a mare that Missy Harlow thought had a bruised hoof, and the barn was cold and quiet and smelled of hay and animals, and he had come in looking for the mare for the same reason and found Sadie already there, crouching beside the horse's foreleg with a competent, careful manner that he had not expected. "You know horses?" he asked, surprised. "My father had too," she said. "I learned enough." He crouched beside her and looked at the hoof, and they were close in a way that the size of the barn did not strictly require, and she was aware of that, and she thought he was too. He examined the hoof and agreed with her assessment, and they stood up at the same moment and were closer than either had planned. He did not step back. She did not step back. "Sadie," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not exactly an answer to anything he had asked yet, but which somehow communicated what she meant. He reached out and touched her face, not the jaw-tipping gesture of dramatic romances, but something simpler and more particular, the back of 2 fingers against her cheek, warm against the cold of the barn, asking a question in the most direct and gentlest way possible. She turned her face slightly into his hand, which was the clearest answer she could think of. He kissed her. Carefully, unhurried, the way he seemed to do everything that mattered, as though he had all the time in the world and intended to use it properly. She kissed him back with the feeling of something long under tension finally releasing, not dramatically but with the completeness of things that are genuinely meant. When they separated, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and they were both, she thought, slightly astonished, though not by each other, more by the simple and overwhelming fact of it. "I have been wanting to do that since October," he admitted. She laughed, which was not what she had expected to do, but his expression when she laughed shifted into something so warm and open that she was glad she had. "I have been aware of that," she said. "Was it?" "Yes," she said. "Very much yes." He exhaled, slow and relieved. She thought it was extraordinary, actually, that a man so sure of himself in every practical matter could be this uncertain about this. She found it enormously endearing. They walked back to the house together through the cold, not holding hands because the ground was icy and they needed their hands for balance, but close enough that their arms touched occasionally, and each time felt deliberate. Mrs. Harlow looked at them when they came in with the complete expressionlessness of a woman who has known what was happening between them since roughly the 3rd week of October, and has had the patience to wait for them to figure it out themselves. Pete Duggan looked up from the bacon he was cooking on the stove, and then looked at Abel, and then looked at Sadie, and then looked back at his bacon with the satisfied expression of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. Eli looked up from the floor where he was building something complicated out of sticks and asked if there were going to be more biscuits at breakfast, which adequately summarized his priorities. February brought the first genuine conversation about the future, the real one, with all its complexity laid on the table. They were walking, Abel and Sadie, along the creek bank in the cold afternoon light, the cottonwoods bare and skeletal against the sky, their breath making small clouds in the air. They had been talking about smaller things, working up to the larger ones in the unhurried way that felt natural to both of them. And then Abel stopped walking and turned to her and said, "I want to ask you something important. I've been thinking about how to say it, and I've decided that thinking about it more is not going to improve it." She stopped too and looked at him. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me, and I want, if you want this too, to find a way to keep the children, to make it legal, to give them a home that is permanent, with us." The "with us" landed with the weight of something she had been wanting without quite allowing herself to name it. "You want to formally adopt them," she said. "I want to try," he said. "I know it is not simple. There is legal process involved, and I don't know how long it takes or how difficult it is. But Pete knows a lawyer in Wichita, and I have been putting money aside. I'm not a wealthy man, Sadie. I want to be honest about that. I have my wages and what I've saved, and a small parcel of land I own outright east of here that I have been thinking about for a while." He said all of this with the slightly faster cadence of a man who has prepared this speech and is trying to deliver it accurately before anxiety interrupts. "I am not offering you ease. I am offering you," he paused. "I am offering you me. And everything that implies. And I want to offer the same to those 3 children who have already made up their minds about the matter, from what I can tell." She thought about Clara, who had started leaving small treasures, a smooth stone, a bird feather on the sill of the window where Abel sometimes sat in the evenings. She thought about Eli, who had recently begun addressing Abel as Abel instead of Mr. Rhodes, which in the economy of Eli's social world was significant. She thought about Thomas, who had on 2 separate occasions simply walked across the room and climbed into Abel's lap without invitation, and sat there like this was the most natural and obvious arrangement. She thought about herself, about all the ways this place and these people had become the thing she had been traveling west to find without knowing it. "You said you have land," she said. "Yes." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, a deed which she recognized from the thick paper and the official stamp. 40 acres, east of here about 5 miles, good soil along the creek. I have been planning to build on it eventually, when I had reason to." She took the deed and looked at it. Abel Rhodes, 40 acres, a piece of the Kansas plain that was his and therefore, if she said yes, potentially theirs. She folded it carefully and handed it back to him. "Yes," she said. He blinked. He had clearly prepared himself for more negotiation. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she confirmed. "I will marry you. And yes to the children, and yes to the land, and yes to all of it. I do not need to think about it further. I have been thinking about it since November." She looked at him steadily. "I am not a woman who says yes to things she does not mean, Abel. When I say yes, I mean it completely." The look that crossed his face was the most complete happiness she had seen on him. It broke through his reserved surface like sun through clouds, and it was beautiful. He stepped forward, and she stepped forward, and he kissed her again. And this time it was not careful in the same way the first one had been. It was warm and full and long, and neither of them was in any hurry about it. When they separated, she laughed again. And again he looked at her with that expression that suggested her laugh was his favorite sound, and she thought, "Well, here we are then. This is the thing." The spring of 1879 was one of the busiest seasons Sadie could remember, and she had lived some busy seasons. The wedding was planned for late April, modest and practical and genuine, as both she and Abel preferred. The legal process for the children's adoption had been set in motion through the lawyer in Wichita that Pete Duggan had recommended, a careful, precise man named Mr. Alberry, who had managed to locate documentation confirming that Clara and Eli had no surviving next of kin, and who had found a sworn statement from 2 witnesses to the circumstances of Thomas's placement with Sadie on the stage. It was slow. It was thorough. Mr. Alberry had said it would likely take until summer to finalize, possibly fall, but that the circumstances were favorable. Meanwhile, the parcel of land east of the ranch had become a project that occupied every spare hour, and a good many hours that were not particularly spare. Abel and Pete, with occasional help from 2 of the other ranch hands, had begun framing a house. It was going to be small to begin with, a main room, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, but it had been planned with space in mind, with additions designed for a future of expanding needs. Sadie went out to the site most afternoons when the weather was fine. She brought the children and they watched the house take shape, and sometimes she walked the perimeter of the 40 acres with Abel in the long evening light, talking about where to put a kitchen garden, and whether the creekside pasture was suited to cattle or would be better for horses, and where a proper barn ought to go. These were the conversations of people building a life, and she found them deeply satisfying in a way that she had not known to expect, the particular pleasure of making something real out of something that had only existed in intention. On one of these evenings, walking along the south fence line with the sun going horizontal and copper across the grass, Abel was quiet in his usual comfortable way, and she was thinking about the kitchen garden when he said, without preamble, "Are you happy?" She turned to look at him. "Yes," she said, genuinely. He nodded slowly as though storing that information carefully. "Are you?" she asked. He looked out across the land. She watched his profile against the evening sky, the set of his jaw, the slight squint against the light, the line of his shoulders. He was not a man who performed contentment. He was a man who either had it or did not. "More than I knew how to want," he said, and there was something in those words that reached into her and stayed there. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. They stood like that for a while, looking at their land in the last light, and the future felt not frightening but full. The wedding was on a Saturday in late April, and the whole of the Harlow ranch attended, which amounted to Mrs. Harlow, Pete Duggan, and 4 ranch hands, plus Mr. Alberry, who had come up from Wichita with papers, plus a family of homesteaders named the Birch family from 3 miles east who had become friendly with Sadie over the winter through a mutual exchange of preserved goods and practical assistance, plus the minister from the small Harlan Creek church who turned out, when you got him away from his wind-threatened building, to be a warm man with a good sense of the ceremony of things. Sadie wore the best dress she owned, which was not grand but was blue, a blue-gray that the morning light made look almost silver. Mrs. Harlow had pressed it and added a length of ribbon at the collar from her supply, and Clara had picked a small handful of early wildflowers from along the creek and handed them to Sadie with the gravity of someone performing an important duty. Abel was wearing a clean shirt and his good hat, and a tie that Pete had produced from somewhere and helped him with, and when Sadie walked toward him across the yard of the Harlow ranch, which served as their venue by virtue of having the most flat space and the best shade trees, his expression as he watched her approach was the one she had been collecting since January, the one where the reserve dropped entirely and what was underneath was warm and sure and hers. The minister said the words. Sadie said hers. Abel said his, in the low, careful voice that always meant he was being completely serious, and he looked at her the whole time without looking away, which she did back. When it was done, Pete led an enthusiastic round of cheering that Eli matched with his own version, which involved jumping. Thomas attempted jumping too and landed on his seat and seemed satisfied with this outcome. Clara pressed herself against Sadie's side and allowed herself, under cover of the general celebration, to be held tightly for a moment. Mrs. Harlow kissed Sadie on the cheek and shook Abel's hand and said, "Good man, finally," to Abel, which made him smile. Pete slapped Abel on the back hard enough to be felt, and then looked embarrassed about it and pretended he had not. The dinner that followed was a long, loud, warm affair, with enough food to suggest that several people had been planning it for some time. And as the afternoon went on and the light went gold and the children finally ran themselves into quiet and were arranged on a blanket under the cottonwoods in various stages of sleep, Sadie sat with Abel at the edge of the gathering and watched the evening come in. "Mr. Rhodes," she said, trying the new shape of it. "Mrs. Rhodes," he returned, equally trying the new shape of it, and both of them found it made them smile in the slightly astonished way of people who have gotten something large and good and are still processing the reality of it. The summer brought the completion of the house on the 40 acres. It was real and solid, with proper windows that Abel had ordered and waited 2 months for, and a front porch that looked east across the land, and a kitchen with a good stove that Sadie managed with satisfaction. They moved in on a warm day in July with the help of Pete and 2 of the ranch hands and a borrowed wagon, and the moving consisted mostly of carrying children's things and bedding and kitchen goods and arguing productively about where to put the table. And at the end of the day the house was theirs and the children were asleep in their room, Clara and Eli sharing, Thomas in his own small space, and Sadie and Abel sat on the front porch in the evening silence and listened to the land. "Our land," she said. "Our land," he agreed. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and the sky above the Kansas plains was every color between orange and purple, and the stars were beginning to appear at the edges, and it was so quiet you could hear the grass move. The adoption was finalized in September of 1879. Mr. Albury arrived on a Tuesday with the documentation and laid it on the kitchen table, and Sadie and Abel sat on one side and signed their names, and when it was done, Clara and Eli and Thomas were, in the full legal weight of the territory's courts, their children. Eli, upon being told that this was what the papers meant, asked if it meant he got to stay here forever. When Sadie said yes, he said good, and went back to what he had been doing, which was demonstrating to Thomas how to whistle, a project that had been ongoing for several weeks without notable success. Clara looked at the papers for a long moment. She ran her finger over Sadie's name and then over Abel's name, and then she looked up at Sadie and said, quietly and precisely, "Does this mean you are our mother and he is our father?" Sadie's throat did something complicated. "If you would like that," she said. Clara considered this with great seriousness. Then she nodded once with the finality of someone making a decision they have thought about carefully. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." She went and found Abel in the yard where he was mending a fence post, and she stood next to him until he looked up, and then she said, "You are my father now," with the same decisive clarity, and Abel set down his tools and crouched to her level and said, "Yes, I am." "And you are my daughter," and Clara let herself be hugged, which she did rarely and always with the air of permitting something rather than seeking it, but this time she held on, which was different. Abel stood up after Clara had gone back inside, and he stood for a moment with his back to the house, looking at the far line of the horizon, and Sadie, who had watched from the kitchen window, thought she saw him bring his hand briefly to his face, and she loved him so completely in that moment that it almost frightened her. The first winter in their house was a good one, hard in the way frontier winters were hard, but good. Pete came for dinner every Sunday, which had become a custom established so naturally that no one remembered establishing it. Mrs. Harlow came out twice a month and was received with the warmth due to someone who had been, in all the ways that mattered, the first person to open a door when doors needed opening. The children grew, all three of them visibly, almost alarmingly, in the way children grow when they have enough food and warmth and certainty. Eli turned 6 in the fall and received from Abel a proper pair of boots, and from Pete Duggan a harmonica, which was either a brilliant or a catastrophic gift, depending on the time of day and your proximity to it. Clara was reading fluently by December, working her way through the storybook Abel had given her at Christmas and periodically reading passages aloud to Thomas, who sat beside her with an expression of intellectual engagement that was probably more about following his sister's face than parsing the narrative. Thomas turned 3 in the spring and had developed a personality of pronounced opinions and enormous charm, a combination that was both exhausting and irresistible. And in the spring of 1880, Sadie had news for Abel that she delivered in the kitchen on a Sunday morning after the children had gone to feed the horses with Pete. She told him simply, because she was always simple about important things, and she watched his face move through surprise and then through something enormous and bright, and then he stood up from the table and came around to her and held her with a care that was both gentle and completely certain, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the steady, reliable beat of his heart. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "Are you happy?" He asked the same question he had asked her on the fence line in the autumn light. "More than I knew how to want," she said, giving him back his own words, and she felt him exhale the same slow, complete exhale of relief and joy that he had given her on that cold January day when she had said yes on the creek bank. Their son arrived in November of 1880, and they named him James Franklin Rhodes, James for Abel's father, Franklin for the man who had built the Harlow Ranch, and who Mrs. Harlow still spoke of with the quiet steadiness of a love that does not end. He was a large, healthy, loud baby with Abel's dark hair and Sadie's gray-green eyes, and he announced his presence in the world with considerable conviction, and did not significantly reduce his volume for the first several months. Clara, who was 9 by then, took the business of a new baby with the seriousness she brought to everything, and appointed herself primary assistant to Sadie in matters of infant management, a role she performed with impressive competence. Eli's position on James was straightforwardly enthusiastic. "He's the best thing we've ever had," he declared, which was high praise from a child who also valued his harmonica and his horse and his dog. Thomas, who was 3, was uncertain about James for approximately 1 week, and then decided they were friends, a decision James confirmed at the earliest possible opportunity by grabbing Thomas's finger and not letting go. Pete Duggan arrived the evening after James was born with a small carved figure that he set on the table without ceremony, and then sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and talking about ranch business as though he were not there specifically to see the baby and was only there incidentally. Abel eventually put James into his arms without asking, and Pete sat very still and looked at the baby with an expression of profound and somewhat helpless tenderness, and did not speak for a while. "He's a good one," Pete finally said. "He is," Abel agreed. Mrs. Harlow arrived the next morning and stayed for a week, cooking and managing the household with the efficiency of a general, and when she left she held Sadie's hands for a moment in the kitchen and looked at her with the complete, warm, unsentimental approval of a woman who does not give that approval easily. "You have done well," Mrs. Harlow said, "both of you." "We had good help," Sadie said. "You made something out of it, Mrs. Harlow said, which was her particular way of acknowledging that you had done the essential work yourself, and was meant as the highest of compliments. The years on the 40 acres were full. Abel built a proper barn in the summer of 1881 and expanded the cattle operation with a small herd of his own, running them on the eastern pasture where the creek grass was good. Sadie established the kitchen garden she had planned and expanded it until it was producing enough to preserve and sell, which she did through the Harlan Creek dry goods store, jams and pickles and dried herbs, and the income, while not large, was hers entirely, and she managed it with the satisfaction of a woman who likes to have something that is specifically hers. She also, in the fall of 1882, began teaching. The Harlan Creek School had finally gotten a proper building, not the one-room structure that had been variously used as a school and a meeting hall and a hay storage facility, but an actual 2-room schoolhouse, and needed a teacher. Sadie took the position and rode the 5 miles each way 3 days a week, and the work of it fed something in her that the ranch work did not because the ranch work was not meaningful, but because teaching was the particular thing she had been traveling west to find at the very beginning. She taught children their letters and their numbers, and she read to them from books she ordered through the Wichita bookshop, and she argued with the county school board when they cut the funding for books and won, and she drove the process of getting an additional teacher hired when the school grew to more children than one person could manage, and she was very good at it, in the direct and undaunted way that she was good at most things she decided to do. Abel watched her ride home on teaching days with the particular expression of a man who is watching someone he loves do the thing they were made to do. He never suggested she reduce the days or give it up. He managed the additional household load on those days himself, with Clara's assistance, and he did so without making it feel like a concession or a sacrifice, simply as the obvious arrangement of a household where both people's work was valuable. This was the thing she had come to understand about Abel Rhodes, slowly and completely over the years of knowing him, that his respect for her was not conditional on her staying in a particular lane. He was not a man who wanted her to be smaller than she was. He was a man who wanted her to be entirely herself, and found her more interesting and wonderful the more fully she was. She told him this once, late at night when they were lying in bed and the house was quiet and the children were all asleep, and he had listened with the serious, attentive quality that she would never stop finding remarkable. "That seems like a low bar," he said after she finished. "It is a less common quality than you might think," she said. He considered that. "I suppose you'd know better than me." "I do," she said. He was quiet. She could see the ceiling and the faint moonlight through the window. "For what it's worth," he said, "you make it easy. You are interesting to watch. Everything you do it complete like you mean it." "I do mean it," she said. "I know," he said. "That's the thing." She turned toward him in the dark, and he was already looking at her. And she was, after all this time, after all the accumulated days and seasons and small moments and large ones, still aware of him in the particular way she had been aware of him from the very beginning, which was remarkable and good and hers. In the spring of 1883, Sadie gave Abel the news again, and he received it the same way he had received it the first time, with the enormous bright surprise moving through him, and then settling into something complete and sure. The second child was a girl, born in October of that year, and they named her Ruth Margaret Ruth because Sadie had always loved the name for its simplicity and its steadiness, and Margaret for Mrs. Harlow, who upon learning this sat in the kitchen of the 40-acre house and cried, which she had never done in anyone's presence before, and which she recovered from immediately and denied. Ruth was small and dark-eyed, and from the very beginning had the quality of someone who was going to be exactly as much trouble as she decided to be, and was going to do it with complete charm. James, who was 3, investigated her with serious scientific interest. Thomas, 5, was immediately devoted. Eli, 8, was briefly put out and then won over. Clara, 10, took her the way she took most things, with quiet, fierce, permanent love. By the summer of 1884, the family that had begun on the steps of the Harlan Creek Frontier Orphanage on an October afternoon in 1878 was 5 children and 2 adults, housed in a now considerably expanded house on 40 acres that had a proper barn and a kitchen garden and a small cattle operation, and a clear, cold stretch of creek that the children treated as their personal domain. There had been a dog since 1881, when Pete Duggan had arrived with a puppy, and the expression of a man who had found it and not gone looking for it, and the dog's name was Frank because Eli had named him, and Eli had been reading about a man named Frank that week. Pete Duggan remained a fixed point of their universe, present every Sunday and for most major events, and at no shortage of ordinary ones. He had never married, and did not seem to feel the lack of it. His family was here, in this house and on this land, and he seemed to understand and be glad of it. He taught Eli to rope properly, and taught Thomas to ride, and taught Clara to play the harmonica with more musicality than he himself possessed. And he sat on the porch in the evenings after Sunday dinner, and talked with Abel in the comfortable way of men who have trusted each other long enough not to need anything from the conversation except the company. Mrs. Harlow came and went, and the ranch continued to prosper under her management, and she never gave any indication of slowing down or softening, though she had the particular soft spot for the Rhodes family that she would never directly acknowledge and everyone knew about completely. On a September evening in 1884, when the sky had gone the particular late summer color of dark blue going to purple, and the stars were extraordinary above the plains, Abel and Sadie sat on the front porch after the children were in bed. He had coffee, and she had a cup of the herbal tea she had taken to drinking in the evenings, and Frank the dog was sprawled across the porch boards with the utter relaxation of a dog who knows he is home. Sadie had the journal he had given her for Christmas of 1878. She had filled 3 journals by now and started a 4th, and this was an early one that she had taken down from the shelf for some reason, and she had been reading a page from it while the evening came in. "What does it say?" Abel asked. She looked at it. "October 1878, she said. "I wrote, stood today in the street in Harlan Creek with the children and no plan and was afraid, which I am not often. A man named Abel Rhodes said they could come with him. I did not know whether to trust that. I thought I would write it down in case I needed to remember that I had been afraid, and it had turned out to be all right." The silence between them was the comfortable, full kind. "Was it?" he asked. "All right." She set the journal down and looked at him, and the evening light was on his face, and his dark eyes were warm and steady. And she thought of everything that was in this house behind them. The children sleeping, Clara and Eli and Thomas, who had been on the street with her that October day, and were now safe and whole in hers and his, James and Ruth, who were born out of this life they had made. The house they had built and the land they had worked, and the 6 years of days accumulated between that first moment on a dusty Kansas street and this quiet September porch. "Better than all right," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the quiet of a completely known and deeply loved evening. And across the 40 acres, the creek moved over its stones in the dark, and the stars came fully out above the plains, and the dog shifted contentedly on the porch boards. And inside the house 5 children slept in the particular profound and trusting sleep of children who are entirely certain they are safe. In the morning there would be breakfast to make and animals to tend and lessons to prepare, and the ordinary, rich, demanding work of a life fully lived. There would be Eli's questions and Thomas's opinions, and James's considerable volume and Ruth's determined explorations, and Clara's quiet, observant presence at the edges of everything, watching the world with those dark eyes that saw so much and said only exactly what she meant. There would be all of it, the whole loud, warm, complicated, beautiful business of it. And Sadie Mercer Rhodes, who had walked 7 miles on an October morning with 3 children and $11 and no plan, and been turned from a door, and been found on a street by a man who had said simply, "Then they come with me," sat on her porch in the September evening and held her husband's hand and knew, with the calm and complete certainty of someone who has arrived exactly where they were supposed to be, that she was home. Abel squeezed her hand once, as though reading the thought. She squeezed back. The stars kept coming and the creek kept moving, and the night settled gently around the house on the 40 acres, and it was good.